Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? We ride the stories of the West, campfire, truth's trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The pine needles were little knives. They bit through Nora Hale's palms as she crawled, and the sting felt bright, almost clean against the dull ache that had taken the rest of her body. Cold gnawed at her ribs. Every breath came thin and raw. Her tongue tasted like rust. The world was white that had been thumbed with gray trunks and drifts and the wet glitter of ice. She had stopped screaming a long time ago. Sound kept what it asked for, and the wind took everything. Snow powdered her hair. Blood had clotted stiff along the side of her head. When she lifted her hand, the red on her skin looked too dark, like old varnish. She pushed forward anyway, clasp to clasp along the crusted snow, pulling dragging heart, hitting fast as a trapped bird. A wheel rattled somewhere in her skull. A wagon, a hymn, a man who said God with a mouthful of sugar. Reverend Abel Cole had smiled when he said humility. Hank Mercer's thumbs had pressed hard into the soft under her jaw. Ephraim Pike's laugh was round and low and bored. They had taken the coin sewn into her hem. They had taken the brooch. They had tried to take her name. A little drift of breath fogged and vanished. She looked at it and thought of ovens and warm bread and a towel hung over a chair to dry. The thought hurt. She let it go. The valley was a bowl of wind. Needles hissed, then bent, then hissed again. At first she thought the crunching rhythm was a trick the wind played, but it grew distinct, heavy, regular, the sound of a horse that did not hurry and did not stop. Nora lifted her face. Snow burned her eyelids. A shape moved between the trees, darker than the trees, taller than the shadows. A rider came on a bay with a black mane, the animal's breath blooming white in the air. The man sat quiet with his shoulders sunk into a sheepskin coat, his hat brim the same color as the trees. He did not call out. She shut her eyes. Warmth reached her before touch did, a weight of presence that belonged to fire, or a chest, or a blanket, something from a life where hands did not close like traps. The horse snorted and danced, once hooves punching ice. Leather creaked. A boot scuffed near her ear. A voice followed, rough with cold and disuse. "Speak if you can." She shaped a word and felt it split her lips open. "Let me die." "Not tonight." He stepped back. She heard him move, deliberate and quiet, not a twig broken by accident. He walked a loop that widened and then came back to her, the circle of a man who trusted the forest as much as he feared it. Snow whispered on his coat. The metal click of a rifle's hammer came and went. His horse flicked an ear, lowered its head, stamped, then waited. He crouched where the snow had crusted into a low ledge. He tipped a fist of tinder out of a leather pouch and built a small V of sticks, windward side closed, with a slab of bark. Flint sparked once, twice. The third spark caught. He bent close and breathed slow and steady. The flame grew into a hard-won coin of orange. It licked the bark black. The smoke smelled like pitch, like sap. Light warmed her cheek and made the blood along her temple shine. He came back. His gloved fingers brushed the matted hair off her eyes. His face was all plains and shadow, and a beard that had gone to salt along the jaw. There was nothing soft in it, only a stillness that did not look away. "Can you feel your legs?" Nora tried. Pain arrived like a hand clamped under her ribs, and she made a sound that was not a word. "All right." He dropped his coat open and settled it over her. The wool was heavy and held the damp animal heat of his body. It smelled like smoke and iron and something clean under both. The weight shocked her, then steadied her. "I'm going to lift you." "No." It came out small. She wasn't afraid of the carrying. She was afraid of being handled of fingers that thought they had the right to close. "You can fight and spend your last heat in the snow." He did not change the level of his voice. "Or you can save the last of it for the ride." She looked at him. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that could hold a storm, or a morning, or a blank. There was no plea in them, no promise, just the fact of the night and the fact of his horse and a choice. She nodded. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees. The lift tore through her side and turned her breath into a whistling gasp. She bit her lip and tasted metal. He did not pause. He moved like a man who had done the same thing with deer quarters and sacks of flour, and the weight of bad days, and all of it had taught his body to be efficient. The horse rolled its eye when he came close, carrying her. He spoke to it in a low voice that was more wind than word. "Easy, copper, easy." He swung up into the saddle with a sound that was half grunt, half breath, and then hauled her across his lap. The act was a practical ugliness. It worked. He tucked the coat under her legs across her shoulders, snugged the front closed, then took the reins and turned Copper's head. The little fire, bright and brave a minute ago, blew sideways under a new gust and sank to red. Branches slapped his shoulders and slid along the hat brim. Snow found her eyelids and her mouth and the corner where her neck met the collar of the coat. Heat bled across her back where she pressed against him and gathered in one place along her hip, where the leather of his belt pushed. Copper's stride had a long, deliberate roll, each hoof punching down through the crust, then dragging up with a gritty scrape. The sound set a pace her body answered, because the body likes rhythm, even when the mind is tired of staying alive. She drifted and snapped back, drifted again. She saw the coachman's box and the neat stack of hymnals and the brass corners of a book. She saw Hank's hands like animals. She saw Ephraim's mouth open around a laugh that did not match his eyes. Then the trees returned, and the horse and a piece of her own breath. The man's heartbeat was a slow thud through the coat at her back. It had a stubbornness that comforted her against her will. He rode leaning forward, head low to the wind body, curved around the weight on his lap to cut the air in a shape that spared her the worst of it. He did not speak into her hair. He did not ask questions. He kept the horse moving and the line of travel steady, and that was a kind of mercy. The climb changed under them. The ground took on a shallow tilt to the left. Pine gave way to darker fir. The wind lost one note and picked up another. He nudged Copper, and the horse obeyed without complaint, ears pricked, breath ringing in the cold. When he broke through a stand of young trees and into a clearing, she saw it first as a darker rectangle against gray, then as a cabin built into the shoulder of a hill. The roof had a belly of snow. The chimney was a blunt black square. No light showed at the window. The world here smelled like ice and old smoke, and the metallic hush that comes before a fresh fall. He slid to the ground with her. One knee hit snow. The shock of it jolted up through his body into hers, and she bit down to keep from crying out. He adjusted his hold, shoved the door with his shoulder, and it gave under the push, the wood grunting against the jamb. Cold air spilled into colder air. The horse snorted and shook its head behind them. He carried her inside. The dark had a weight to it thick and familiar to the room. He set her on a narrow cot that sat along the far wall. The mattress was 2 inches of ticking over something less than comfort. It was the best thing she had felt in days. Stay? It was redundant and still felt like care. He moved through the dark without groping. His hand found the lantern on the center table. He struck a match with his thumbnail. The sulfur bit her nose. Light pulled the room forward. A cast-iron stove sat squat and patient with a loose handle on its door. Shelves along one wall held tins and sacks that had been folded down to take up less space. A barrel hugged the corner. A crust of ice ringed inside its mouth. A rifle leaned by the door, like a third man waiting to be asked a question. He opened the stove and the iron groaned. He packed it full. Bark popped as the fire took and flared, painting the ceiling with moving amber. Heat began to climb out of the stove in waves she could count. He filled a kettle and set it on top. A thin, talkative hiss began under the lid. He glanced at her, once the brief sort of look a man gives when he is measuring distance and injuries and time. She saw what she must look like in his eyes, and for a moment she wished the lantern would go out. Her fingers had curled into the wool at her chest. She forced them open. Skin stuck, then let go. She pulled the coat closer anyway. Her breath slowed. The burn inside ribs turned down a notch. The kettle gave a low shudder. He reached, lifted, and poured a trickle into a tin mug to warm his hands. He did not drink yet. Steam ghosted up and vanished. The wind leaned against the far wall and scraped a branch across the logs, and then leaned again. He looked at the door. The door looked back at him the way only a piece of wood can, asking to be trusted. He set the mug down and crossed to it. His fingers found the heavy bar. He raised it and let it fall into the iron hooks. Wood met iron with a clean, dull sound. Catch! The wind kept talking. The room held its shape. The fire took another breath and climbed. He went back to his chair and sat. He set his hat on the table and let the steam from the mug fan his face. He kept his rifle angled against the leg within reach. The horse's hooves clinked once outside and then settled. Somewhere in the rafters a pine knot ticked as sap warmed. Nora lay under the coat with the weight of the room holding her in place. Pain had not left. It had changed its tone. Heat pricked at her skin. The smell of smoke cut through the taste of iron. Her body, stubborn in ways she had never admired, surrendered to the work that had been done for it and the heat that had been built around it. The man watched the door and the fire, and the small point where the kettle breathed and the steam rose. He did not look at her. He did not need to. It felt like the same thing either way. Outside, the wind stayed busy in the trees. Inside, there was the sound of wood catching, and the door barred. Catch. Night thinned to a gray seam along the window. The room had taken the shape of the fire. Heat lay close to the stove and faded toward the cot where Nora lay under the sheepskin coat. Her breath sounded less like a blade pulled across her ribs. Wyatt sat in the chair with his hands wrapped around the warm tin mug. He watched the stove door as if it could change its mind. When he rose, the chair legs scraped wood. He set the mug down without drinking. He crossed to the cot and knelt, moving slow enough to give every second a chance to make sense. He reached for the knife at his belt. Metal caught the lantern light. Nora jerked back on instinct, eyes wide, mouth ready to break. "For the dress," he said. The words were quiet. He did not lift the blade higher. "It is freezing you." Her throat worked. She held the coat closed under her chin and nodded once. Her fingers shook when she tried to help. He stopped them with a touch to her wrist, gentle, brief. He cut along the seams so the fabric fell away in pieces instead of tearing. The cotton had gone hard with ice and blood. It gave up in stiff flakes and dragged fibers. He cut the sleeves first, then the shoulder. He kept his hands where she could see them. The dress landed in a heap at the foot of the cot. Underneath her shift was torn and just as cold. He set the knife down and reached for the kettle. Steam lifted and carried the smell of metal and heat. He poured enough into a basin to make the cloth heavy and not scald. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack, dipped it, twisted it once, and brought it to her face. "This will sting," he said. It did. Hot water found raw places. She flinched and then set her jaw. He cleaned the blood at her hairline and along the temple where the cut had clotted. The blood gave up slow. The water in the basin turned a pale pink. He pressed the cloth, lifted, pressed again. It was work, not ceremony. He found the bite-shaped bruise on her shoulder. His breath changed, not louder, just different. He went to the shelf, fetched the whiskey, and soaked a fresh strip. When the rag touched her skin, pain rose so sudden she arched off the cot before she could stop it. He steadied her with one hand on the good shoulder. "I know," he said. "It has to be clean." He did not speak more. He did not hurry. He moved along arms, hands, ribs, finding cuts that had filled with grit, scrapes that had iced. He wrapped her ribs in a long band of cloth and knotted the ends flat so they would not rub. He worked until the stove ticked hot and the lantern smoked. When he finished, she lay on the cot with the coat pulled up to her chin and the blankets he owned piled on top. Heat moved under the weight and came back to her from the wool and the coarse ticking. She could feel her fingers again. The feeling hurt, which felt like a promise of more. He put the knife back on his belt. He wiped his hands on a rag. He poured water from the barrel into the kettle and set it to heat again. He did not ask questions. He did not say her name. He went back to the chair and took his first swallow of the coffee. It was stronger than it needed to be, and it hit hard and bitter, a taste that could make a man feel awake while still tired. Nora slept without meaning to. Sleep took her by the ankle and pulled. She woke when the room had turned from gray to a thin white. Snow dusted the window in fern shapes. Wyatt had his coat on. He stood at the door with one hand on the bar. "Eat," he said, and put a tin plate near the cot. A slab of salt pork sat beside a wedge of biscuit. Grease had cooled on the meat and left a dull film that caught the light. She pushed herself up on one elbow. The world tilted and steadied. Her pride arrived a hair before her hunger and then stepped aside. She ate with small, fast bites. The food was heavy and plain. It steadied her the way the coat had. Wyatt watched the door as he spoke. Snow was drifted against it, 4 feet on this side. "You go out there in that shirt, you will not come back." She looked toward the door and saw nothing but the wood. She looked back at him. He lifted the bar. Iron met wood. The sound had weight. "Catch. I am setting my traps," he said. "I will be gone some hours." He opened the door and the wind shouldered in like a visitor who believed it belonged. He pulled the door shut from the outside. The bar fell into place. The sound came again, softer through the wood. "Catch." She stayed still for a minute, listening to the wind, the stove, the small sounds a room makes when it is inhabited. She slid her feet to the floor. The dirt was cold through her skin. She stood slow, one hand on the wall. The room shifted and then sorted itself out. She looked down. She wore a long linen shirt that hung to mid-thigh. The sleeves had been rolled to keep the cuffs dry. The shirt smelled like him and the stove and the faint ghost of soap. The shame that rose to her face came with heat, and a quick breathing. She pushed it down. The shirt was warm. Warmth mattered. She made the cot. It took a long time. Her hands shook and her ribs protested, and the blankets were heavier than they looked, but when the corners were square, something inside her eased. She folded the coat and laid it at the foot of the bed where his dress had fallen. A broom leaned in the corner. It was a bundle of birch tied tight around a stick. She took it up and began at the door. The sweep was careful at first, then steady. Ash gathered by the stove. Bits of bark and grit marched into a small pile by the threshold. Dust rose and settled. The act made a rhythm she could walk inside without tripping. When she finished, the room looked like someone had asked it to be itself, and it had agreed. She sat on the cot and wrapped her hands around her knees. She listened for hooves. The wind did its best to sound like hooves, and then gave up. Wyatt returned with the weather on his shoulders. He stamped once and brushed snow from his coat. He noticed the floor first, and then the folded blankets, and then the ash banked neatly by the side of the stove. He did not comment. He took off his gloves and set them to steam on the stove corner. He hung his coat on the peg and his hat under it. He cooked stew with dry beans and what rabbit he had left. The smell lifted out of the pot and floated salt and fat, and something sweet the onion gave up. He set the pot to the back and ladled 2 shallow bowls. He put one on the table, and then after a pause that was not long, he carried the other to the table as well. He sat opposite and kept his eyes on his spoon. Nora came slow with one hand on the table's edge. She sat and held the bowl with both hands. The heat soaked into her palms. The first mouthful felt like a small rescue. They ate in quiet. Spoons touched tin and the stove breathed. The storm hunted around the eaves and decided to circle. When the bowls were empty, he stood and took them to the barrel. He poured a line of water and scrubbed the bowls with sand. He returned the bowls to the shelf and reached for the coffee pot. He poured 2 cups and set one by her hand. He kept his for himself and did not look surprised when she did not drink. He drank his with his eyes on the window. Morning folded into afternoon. He mended a boot with a crooked awl. She sorted the shelf where the sacks sat and tied them down tight. He cut kindling. She stacked it along the wall by the stove. The room settled around the work until the work felt like breath. Late in the day, when the light had gone cold, Nora stood and tried the door. Her fingers found the bar. She lifted. It did not move. Not because the wood had swollen, because he had dropped the bar from the outside. She let her hand fall. She looked at the cot. She looked at him. He did not turn. He kept his eyes on the leather he was stitching. "I locked the world out," he said. Her shoulders eased a fraction. It felt true. It did not make the small catch in her chest disappear. It made it something she could live with while it was there. That night, the wind rose and then fell. Wyatt banked the fire, set the kettle to the side, and dragged his bedroll near the stove. He checked the load on the rifle and set it within reach. He did not offer the cot. He did not ask for it. He lay down without speaking and turned his face toward the stove door as if it were another window. Nora lay on the cot and watched the shadow of the stovepipe slide across the ceiling. The cabin breathed. The heat found the corners and sat in them. The latch had its own memory of the day. Somewhere inside that sound there was the first night and then this one. Somewhere inside it there was room for another breath. The kettle sighed. The fire clicked. The room held still. Morning kept its pale hold. Frost drew fern bones on the window. The stove breathed a steady heat that smelled like sap and iron. Wyatt had shaved with cold water and a dull mirror. He poured coffee that looked useful and set a cup at the table for Nora without being asked to. She took it and held it for warmth. She took a sip and snorted. Her mouth pulled tight. He lifted an eyebrow. "It could strip paint," she said. He tasted his. He made a slow face he did not hide. "You trying to teach it a lesson?" A laugh slipped out of her and surprised both of them. It was short and hoarse, and it left a better taste than the coffee. She added a pinch of water to the cup and tried again. It was still too strong. She drank anyway. They ate rabbit stew for breakfast because there was no rule against it. Steam rose and fogged the side of the bowl, and then vanished. Wyatt sat across from her shoulders, set hands sure. He ate clean. He did not clatter the spoon. "Where is this?" she asked. The question rested on the bowl, so it did not float away. "2 valleys north of the northern Pacific spur," he said. "Cutthroat Ridge behind. Bitter Root the other way. Closest town is Kestrel Falls if the road is not gone." She nodded. The names drew a small map in her head and made the white outside feel less like an ocean. She ate until the bowl was empty and only the sheen of fat remained. She pushed it away and watched how steam had dampened an oval on the table. Wyatt stood and did the washing. He seemed to have made a consultation with silence and won. When he was done, he turned the kettle a little to keep it from boiling over. He took a block of wood from the shelf and set it on the table. He brought out a small knife with a nick in the handle. He did not tell her what he meant to do. The knife began to move. Shavings fell in thin curls that smelled green and sweet. The shape came slowly out of the wood. A quill first, then the barbs. He pinched the body between thumb and first finger and drew the blade toward him in short, patient strokes. He worked with the attention a man gives a simple job he likes. Nora watched his hands. There was size in them, and an economy she had already learned to trust. Scars crossed the left one in white seams. The nail on the ring finger of the right had a half moon of old blood under it. He did not look up unless the knife asked him to, and then only for a second. The day passed in acts that filled it without fanfare. He checked the traps and came back with 3 empty snares and 1 thin rabbit. She cleaned the table and swept up the last of yesterday's ash. He fixed a loose hinge with a nail filed down to fit. She sewed a tear in the blanket with thread pulled from a sleeve seam. The work made something between them that did not need naming. Light thinned early. The cabin kept its breath even. Night set in. Wind scraped a branch along the roof and then let it fall. Nora lay on the cot and did not sleep right away. Her body knew where it had been hurt and was quick to remind her. The stove ticked and ticked. Sleep found her at last and did not keep her kindly. She saw a field of snow and the black lip of pines. She saw a book with brass corners. She saw a hand cover her mouth, and the smell of old wool filled her head. Laughter arrived small and cheap and would not stop. She sat up with a sound that ripped its way out and left her empty. Wyatt was there. He had moved without haste or noise. He did not touch her. He sat on the edge of the cot with his weight on his heels and his rifle leaned against his leg from habit. The lamp was turned low. His face was a set of lines and shade. He waited. Her breath came rough. She pressed heels of hands into her eyes until sparks danced behind the lids. She lowered them and kept her hands where he could see them. The gasping eased. "My name is Nora," she said. The words weighed more than they should. They sank into the space between them. "Nora Hale." He nodded once. "Wyatt Sloan." The names hung and then took a place in the room, along with chair, stove, door, the knot in the ceiling log that looked like a bad eye if you stared too long. Nora swallowed. The taste of iron had given up a little. She found her voice again and it came out low. "I was with a wagon," she said. "A preacher, Reverend Abel Cole." Wyatt's eyes held steady. He did not blink fast. He did not lean forward. He let her speak or not speak. It helped. "They said I had pride," she said. "They called it humbling." The word scraped its way up. Her hands closed around the edge of the blanket until her knuckles went white. She did not go farther. The path went black if she did. He gave a small nod, the kind a man gives a horse that is skittish but still honest. He set the rifle aside, slow, a hand's breadth at a time, and pulled his chair an inch closer. He did not fill the inch with touch. He filled it with presence. "The wind used to be the only loud thing," he said. His voice had gravel and a flatness that sounded like truth. "I had a sister, Maggie, 17. I was 20. We were in Kansas then. A man came through, cards, slick talk, quick hands. I told her to stay clear." The stove popped. A coal broke and settled. He looked at the hinge on the door and not at her as he spoke. It gave him room to walk through the memory. "He pushed her into me," he said. "I went for him. I should have gone for the knife. I did not. She fell. It was quick. She looked at me like it was a question. Then she went, and I did not find a better way to say goodbye." The room listened. The wind tried to talk over it and failed. "I left," he said. The quiet after was loud. Storms were easier than that quiet. I could stand out in it and not hear my own head. He felt quiet. That quiet had nothing sharp in it. Nora could move inside it. She uncurled her fingers one by one from the blanket. Her ribs hurt, but less. She knew the price of a story told plain. It was not a trade. It was a laying down beside. He reached into his pocket and brought out the piece of wood he had been working. It had become a feather as light could make it. The quill was narrow. The barbs were suggested more than carved, just enough to catch a shadow. "It is not worth much," he said. The words were awkward in his mouth. He set the feather on the small table by her cot instead of in her hand. "It helps to make things into the right shape." She looked at it and then at him. "Thank you." He gave the smallest of shrugs and looked at the stove, with an attention that let both of them breathe. The kettle muttered. He lifted it and poured a little water into a cup, as if that were the most pressing task in the world. He set the cup on the table and left it there. Nora eased down and let the coat find her shoulders again. She had told a sliver, and he had told a sliver, and the room had taken both and held. Wind moved around the walls like a big animal that had lost interest. The bar across the door sat in its irons and kept its promise without making a sound. She touched the carved feather with 2 fingers and felt the grain lift under her skin. It did not look like flight. It looked like something made to remind the hand that held it that it could still hold. Wyatt pulled his bedroll closer to the stove and lay down on his side with his back to the heat. He drew the blanket up to his shoulder and exhaled through his nose so slow it might have been a count. The rifle stayed close. The room took the new weight and settled. Nora watched the stovepipe shadow turn and fade. She closed her eyes and found a piece of sleep that did not bite. The air in the cabin felt warmer than the fire could account for. It felt like a door had opened somewhere and stayed open. The hinge did not squeal. Outside, snow sifted in small grains and hissed where it hit old ice. Inside, the kettle breathed the feather caught a little shine, and 2 names sat where they belonged. The night came on with a new voice. Snow hissed in the stovepipe. The rafters clicked. The latch rasped against its irons as if the door wanted to speak and thought better of it. Nora slept and did not. She listened to Wyatt breathe from his bedroll and tried to make her own breath match the slow count. The wind lifted. It pressed its cold mouth to every seam of the cabin. Wyatt sat up. He listened the way a man listens for a thing he has known too long. He stood and pulled on his boots. He put his coat on but did not fasten it. He did not take the rifle. He set a hand on the stove to borrow heat for his fingers and then crossed to the door. He lifted the bar. Iron met wood and made the small, clean sound. Catch. Nora pushed herself up on one elbow. What are you doing? He kept his eyes on the door. Checking the wood. It will drift. He stepped out into the white. Cold slapped the room. The door fell back into place under its own weight, but did not catch. A crack of sky showed. Wind curled a hand in and stirred the lantern flame. Wyatt. She swung her legs to the floor. The linen shirt bit cold against her skin. She grabbed the sheepskin coat and shrugged into it as she went. Her ribs complained. She put a hand flat on the wall to steady herself and then moved again. Outside, the air cut. Snow did not fall so much as fly. It came sideways in fast, fine streams that stung where they found a face. The world was a white that had decided to erase shapes and start over. The woodpile sat as a low-dark hump against the drift. Wyatt stood near it with his coat open and his head tipped back. His hair was wet where the wind had lifted his hat right off and thrown it. He watched the sky without blinking. Easier to hear it like this, he said, not turning when she reached him. Get inside, she said. Her voice came out thin and angry. You will freeze. I used to come out when it was like this, after Maggie. The wind would get loud enough and the quiet would leave me alone. It is not quiet in there. She reached for his sleeve. Her fingers met cloth that had gone stiff. His arm under it was hard as a beam. He did not give. He took a breath, and the breath looked like smoke. His eyes were open to a thing she could not see. Listen, he said. She listened. It was only wind. It clawed the ridge and rattled in the young spruce and climbed over the roof. It filled the world until there was no room for the past to speak. He stood inside it and let it scrape him clean. His eyelashes had grown white. Nora stepped closer. The coat at her throat thickened the sound of her own pulse. She could taste snow. She set her shoulder under his and pushed once. He swayed. It is only wind, she said. He turned his head. He found her, and his eyes cleared. For a moment he looked both grateful and embarrassed. He nodded and let her pull. They moved together in a slow half-circle and reached the dark square that was the door. He caught the edge and shoved, while she held the weight back with her body. They went in and shouldered the door shut. He slumped into the chair by the stove. His shirt was wet through and cold enough to steam. She hooked the bar up and let it fall. The sound had a steadiness that calmed the room. Catch. Get this off, she said. She did not ask permission. She gripped the edge of his shirt and tugged. The buttons popped like seeds. He hissed when the fabric pulled away from his skin. She hauled the sheepskin coat off her own shoulders and threw it over his. The wool swallowed some of the shaking. Heat from the stove met the heat coming back into his body and made a sharp pine smell. What were you doing? She said. She took his hands in hers and rubbed them until the color changed. His knuckles were raw where the cold had bit. He gave her a look that was half apology and half habit, listening for a thing that is not there. Is it gone? He held still. The wind pushed at the wall. The stove breathed. He lifted his eyes to hers. I think so, he said. The words had the shape of a truth he had not expected to find. Her hands went still. Their faces were close. His breath warmed her cheek. The coat made a small cave around them, and the fire put light into it. Her body answered before her mind did. She leaned in. His hand lifted and found her hair. He brushed it back behind her ear with a touch that weighed almost nothing. His mouth was close enough that she felt the word form before he said it. Nora? Her chest tightened. The heat in the small space picked up the shape of another hand from another night. The smell of wet wool changed to the smell of a wagon, and the press of a thumb under her jaw. She was somewhere that was not this room. She shoved him with a small, sharp panic and scrambled back until her shoulders hit the wall. "Do not," she said. Her voice cracked. She curled forward and hugged the coat to her body, as if it could make her smaller. Wyatt froze. His hand stayed where it was in the air, fingers open, empty. He lowered it slow and pulled the coat tighter around his shoulders. The shame that crossed his face was quick, and then gone, replaced by something flatter, older. He nodded. "All right." He picked up the coffee pot like it mattered again, and poured what was left into the 2 cups. He set one on the table at her side and took the other to his chair. He did not drink. He bent over the cup and let the steam find his face. Silence gathered. It was not the quiet of the storm or the quiet that used to chase him into it. It was a hard piece of ground they both stood on because there was nowhere else. Nora breathed until the shake ran out of her hands. The stove ticked its slow, steady pattern and seemed to approve. She reached for the cup and warmed her fingers on it. The coffee had gone bitter and thin. She did not care. "I killed a man," she said. Wyatt did not lift his head. "Ephraim Pike," she said. "He held me." Hank Mercer did the laughing. "Ephraim held me. He pressed his hand over my mouth and told me to behave for God. I had a knife my mother gave me, for apples. I put it in him. I did not know where. I just pushed until he was not holding me anymore." Her voice did not rise. It got smaller and steadier, a thread pulled clean. "I do not know if he died right then. I think he did. Hank called me a demon and hit me until I was quiet. They took the coins and the brooch and left me. I crawled." Wyatt lifted his head. He was not a man who rushed to fill the space after a confession. He looked at her with a plainness that did not make light of any part of what she had said. He took a breath and let it out. "You did what kept you breathing," he said. She stared at him. The words went through her like a hand taking a knot out of a rope. It hurt, and then it did not in the same second. She did not cry. Her eyes felt dry and sore, like she had already done the crying out in the snow where no one heard. He leaned forward enough to set the coffee aside and then sat back. He did not reach for her. He kept the chair between them and put his hands flat on his thighs to keep them there. He looked smaller and more human in the firelight, a man tired down to the bone, who had learned to speak only when he had something worth the cost. She pulled the coat tighter. Heat settled into her bones in a way that felt earned. The wind moved along the eaves and then down the far wall. The latch held. The bar held. "Catch." Wyatt stood and fed the stove 2 sticks. Flame took and flared. He banked his it and closed the door. The iron ticked 3 times and went quiet. "Sleep if you can," he said. She nodded. She lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin. The feather on the small table caught the light and threw it back dull and kind. Her eyes closed. The room gathered her and did not argue. Wyatt set his bedroll again and stretched on his side with his face toward the heat. He watched the hinge on the door until it blurred. The cabin kept its breath. The wind wore itself out against the ridge. Inside there was the sound of wood settling and a woman drawing air without flinching. Morning opened clean and brittle. The ridge wore a fresh crust that cracked under a boot and sang under a hoof. Wyatt saddled Copper with quiet hands. He checked the cinch, the bit, the worn strap he had mended twice. He tied a small poke of coins to the inside of his coat where the wind could not get them. On the table, he left a folded scrap of paper with 3 words in a square hand: flour, salt, needle. Nora stood by the stove with the kettle in her hands. Steam kissed her face. She set the kettle down and wiped her palms on the linen shirt. Her ribs still ached when she breathed wrong. She looked at the paper and then at him. "Road will hold," he said. She nodded. Her mouth wanted a question and would not give it shape. He took his hat from the peg and set it brim low. He lifted the bar and let it fall once to be sure the irons were true. He opened the door and a clean cold ran its fingers over the floor. He stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him. "Catch." Copper stood with his ears forward and his breath white. Wyatt swung up and turned him toward the pass. Snow along the edges had slumped into dirty scallops. The trail was a ribbon of packed white and mud that had thawed and frozen twice. Trees held their breath. The sky was a hard blue that did not forgive. He rode with his collar up. The The valley fell behind, then the low saddle where wind chewed at the grass in summer and left it brown and whistling. He thought of a bolt of calico with small blue flowers and a ribbon the color of dried cherries. He saw them in the glass case at the Mercantile in Kestrel Falls, where a woman had once laughed at a boy for asking the price of a comb. He could see the jars of penny nails, the paper parcels tied with string, the man behind the counter whose hands stayed clean no matter what he sold. The pass opened in a shallow V cut from the hill. Pines leaned over it black against the sky. A patch of old ice shone dull where rinsed by sun and refrozen at night. Copper put a foot on it and felt for grit. Wyatt let him choose. The horse took the edge of the trail where mud held a little, and pine needles made a mat. Sound changes in a pass. It gathers and carries. Copper's hooves popped in the crust and then went quiet, as if a hand had closed around them. Wyatt stopped him at a bend, where rock offered a little cover. He listened. 2 horses, one heavy, one ordinary. A third set of footsteps shared the rhythm. A pack horse. The voices arrived next, unfolded by the pass, and laid out for anyone who knew how to listen. "You think she is dead?" the first voice said. It had a whine to it, the kind of sound a man makes when he wants to be mean, but is mostly hungry. The second voice was bigger. It came from a chest used to giving orders with a fist. "Reverend says no. Says a sinner took her in. Says he saw it." "Saw it where? In the book." The whine rose. A man spit and missed. Silas was a fool getting himself stuck by a kitchen knife, by a girl. "Hush your mouth," the big one said. "You say his name like that again, and I will put your teeth in my pocket. Reverend wants her back. Wants him too. Says they need purifying." The first man laughed and sounded like he had made himself brave. "Purifying. I can help with that." Wyatt felt his jaw go tight. He kept breathing. He eased Copper into the pines under the bend and let the branches take the shape of his shoulders. He waited until the men rode into view around the curve. The pack horse followed with a sway-backed patience. The big man rode a tall roan with a white blaze. Hank Mercer came behind on a narrow sorrel with a saddle that had seen better riders. Wyatt raised the rifle and held on the roan's shoulder. He found the place a handbreadth behind the joint. He squeezed until everything inside the trigger gave. The shot cracked the pass and threw a flock of startled echoes back at him. The roan screamed and went down hard. The big man's leg pinned under the animal with a thud that sounded like a door thrown shut on a bad day. Hank yanked his pistol and fired toward the sound, a blind panic shot that shaved bark from a pine and killed a cone. "Drop it," Wyatt said from the trees. His voice carried the cold. Hank looked around with the jerky head of a trapped animal. He saw nothing but shadow. He saw Copper's ear for a second and told himself it was a stump. His hand shook. The gun wobbled. "Drop it," Wyatt said again, "or I take your horse's other eye." Hank let the pistol fall. It landed in the slush with a wet, undignified sound. The big man roared and scrabbled at the mud. He pulled a small gun from under his coat with the same hand that had pulled knives under other coats. Wyatt heard the breath that came before the shot and turned toward it. The flash flared low by the ground. The bullet hit him in the side and tore heat and light through him. He fired without thinking. The second shot took the big man in the face and put him flat under the weight of his horse. Silence came down hard enough to shake the snow from a fur. Hank stared. Fear made him thin. He bent at the waist as if a punch had landed. Then some half-coward courage fired backward in him. He dove for the fallen pistol. Wyatt did not have time to raise the rifle. He came out of the trees in 3 quick strides, swung the stock across, and connected with Hank's jaw. The pop was clean. Hank dropped like a sack and stayed. Wyatt leaned a hand on the nearest pine and breathed. The pass pulsed. The cold sunk teeth into the sweat that had sprung up on his neck. He looked at his coat. Blood bloomed in a dark circle and spread. It felt hot at first. Then it felt like he was standing in water up to his ribs and could not find the bank. He holstered the rifle and picked up Hank's pistol. He stuck it in his belt. He glanced down at the big man and did not think about him anymore. He whistled for Copper. The horse came with his head high and his eyes big. Wyatt put a hand to the gelding's jaw and felt the warm velvet there. He gathered the reins and found the stirrup. "Come on," he told himself. It was not meant for anyone else to hear. The mount cost him in sound and in breath. He bit the inside of his cheek and tasted blood over the other blood. He set his weight and turned Copper's head. The ride back was not long and felt like forever. Trees did not stand still. They slid sideways and leaned in. The trail tilted when it should not. Copper did most of the thinking as a good horse will. He kept the pace straight and steady. Wyatt held the horn and kept his body upright by habit and pride, and the memory of a door barred against bad weather. The clearing opened like a mouth. The cabin sat with its roof full of age and snow. Smoke was a thin line, stingy but real. Nora stood in the doorway with the coat on a small bundle in one hand. Her braid was tight, her face was not. She had set the carved feather in her pocket because she could not leave it. She heard Copper before she saw him. The sound came wrong and fast. She stepped out onto the hard patch of ground and saw him stagger. Wyatt slid out of the saddle without arranging it. She ran to meet him and caught as much of him as she could. They went down together. The mud put a cold, wet hand on her knees. "Eli," she said by mistake, and then she had the right name out. "Wyatt?" "Thomas Grow," he said. The word came rough. "Hank, Reverend, they know." The fear slid past her and broke somewhere behind. What stayed was a hard quiet and a list of things to do. She got an arm under his good side and hauled. He pushed with his legs and made a sound he did not want to make. Between them, they got him to the door. She kicked it open and pulled him through. She shoved the door with her foot and lifted the bar one-handed. Iron met wood. "Cash. Water," he said. "Whiskey," she said back. She moved without shaking. She put the kettle on and the stove breathed and caught. She found the bottle and the clean rags. She set the basin where she could reach it. Her hands went to the buttons at his coat and then to the torn shirt. The cloth stuck. She pulled. He grunted. She cut. She rolled the blood-slick fabric away from the wound. The hole was high in the meat above his ribs. The skin around it was already angry and swelling. She breathed once. She poured water to warm the rag and wiped away grit and blood with sore that had no softness in it. "This will burn," she said. "I know," he said. She poured whiskey into the wound. His back arched. His hand found the edge of the cot and closed on it. The sound that left him was not a word, and not shameful. She pressed a clean rag and held until her arms shook. She packed the wound and wrapped a long strip around his middle, tight and flat. She tied the knot where it would not rub. He lay back and breathed with a hitch. Sweat stood out on his lip. His eyes were open and fixed. She brushed hair off his forehead with fingers that had learned to be careful when they wanted to be quick. She looked down and saw the feather in her pocket had streaks of red now. She did not wipe them away. "Stay with me," she said. He looked at her and found the shape of her face. The blue ribbon lived only in his memory for now. He blinked and kept his grip on the world. "You have my bed," he said in the voice of a man who thinks the right thing in the wrong moment. "You have it now," she said. "Lie still." The stove ticked hard. The room filled with the smell of pine and iron and whiskey. The wind pawed at the wall and gave up. Nora set her palm on the bandage to feel the heat and the pulse under it. She did not speak a promise. She poured water, wrung a cloth, and wiped his mouth. The door held. The fire held. His breath found a rhythm she could count. The cabin kept him. The feather in her pocket had learned a new color. The bar across the door remembered its work and did not forget. Wyatt slept like a man who had been pulled through a small, dark hole and left on the other side. Fever came and eased. Nora kept water on the stove and the rag in the basin. She changed the bandage when it soaked through. She counted breaths without meaning to, and lost count when the wind pressed its cold face to the wall. When his eyes opened clear, she was near the door with a small bundle in her hands. The carved feather lay on top where she could see it. She had put bread and a strip of meat and nothing else that mattered. Her braid was tight. Her mouth was a line. He saw the bundle and pushed himself up. Pain tugged at him hard. He put a hand on the cot and stood anyway. The room tilted and steadied. He crossed to her in slow, stubborn steps and set his palm against the door where the bar rested. "You stop dying in advance," he said. "I cannot bring this to you," she said. The words came quick and low. "They will come. They have your name now because of me." "You did not bring them," he said. "They walk where they please. We are not staying to wait." Her grip on the bundle tightened. "Then I should go alone." He shook his head once. It was not a big movement. It did not need to be. "No. We go where a man has to listen when we talk, not in shadows. We go to the town, in daylight, in a room full of faces." Her chest lifted and fell. The bundle trembled. "They will not believe me." "I will speak. I will say what I saw. It will cost me." He looked at the bandage and then at her and did not flinch. "I have the coin." She looked past him to the stove, to the chair, to the bit of floor she had swept until the knuckles in her hands had stopped shaking. She set the bundle down on the table. She nodded once. All right. Wyatt sat before his legs made the choice for him. He drew a slow breath and let it out. There is a small revolver in the box under the shelf. 5 shots. You load it like this. He talked her through each part. She brought the box to the table, and he opened it and set the pieces out. The cartridges were brass dull from fingers. He showed her how to push the rod and clear the cylinder and seat each round. He said belly, and then said again. She raised the empty gun and found a place on the far wall where there was already a scar. He watched her grip and said, lower your wrist. She corrected. He nodded. You pull until it clicks empty, he said. Do not try to scare a man. That is a gift. She put the revolver in the pocket of the coat. The weight was new and not strange. She could feel where it sat. She touched the pocket with the back of her fingers and left her hand there for a breath. He pointed to the pegs by the door. Lean to, there is a mule. She is small and steady. Saddle her, blanket for each, food, bandages, ammunition, rope. She moved and the room moved with her. The lean-to smelled like animals and old hay. The mule watched her with one ear. Copper lifted his head and snorted once and put it back down. She found the blankets and the plain saddles. Her ribs complained when she lifted the rig, but the work had a shape that helped. She laid the saddle on the mule, then the breast strap, then the girth. She did Copper in the same order. She checked the cinch twice. She laid a small pack of food across the mule and tied it down with rope that had felt weather on it and learned to hold. Back inside, Wyatt had pulled on a clean shirt and was pale from the effort. He had his coat halfway on and one sleeve fought him. She came behind and worked the cloth over his shoulder. Her fingers brushed the back of his neck and he did not move. Boots, he said, and she found them and set them by his feet. He looked at the door. He looked at her. You do not run, he said. She met his eyes. I do not run. She looked around the room once more, for what to take that could not be carried. The floor held the mark of her broom. The shelf held tins tied down tight. The lantern held a small ring of soot where the flame had forgotten its manners. On the peg by his hat hung an old bandana, the color of dried cherries that had been washed into brown and kept a memory of red. She took it, folded it, and tied it at the base of her braid. It held her hair and gave her hands something to do for a moment. She lifted the feather from the bundle. She touched the dried streaks with her thumb. She did not wipe them clean. She slid the feather into the inside pocket of the coat where it would sit light and be safe. Wyatt banked the fire until the stove glowed like a heart shut behind iron. He set the kettle aside. He checked the rifle and eased the hammer down. He looked like a man counting what he could not take and making peace with what he would leave. They went to the door. He set his hand on the bar and lifted it. He opened the door and the morning came in cold and smelling like pine and old smoke. They stepped out. He pulled the door shut and reached to the side where he had bored a hole through the jamb a summer ago. He fed a leather thong through and pulled. The bar rose inside and slipped down into the irons. The sound was quiet but clean. Catch! He stood for a breath looking at the door. His eyes did the work of remembering without his face showing it. He turned. Nora helped him across the hard patch to Copper. The ice at the edge of the clearing had a skin that broke under her boots with a small, polite sigh. She put her shoulder under his arm while he set his foot. He pushed and found the saddle and swung his leg and swallowed what that cost him. He settled and drew a breath through his teeth and let it out slow. He gathered the reins. She led the mule to the log that made a mounting block and set her foot and swung up. The animal breathed through its nose and flicked an ear. Nora found the stirrups and took them up a hole. She sat straight because there was no room in her for any other shape. The revolver pressed the coat against her hip. The bandana held her hair. Wyatt turned Copper with a pressure of the knee. The horse set off at a walk and picked his path around the worst of the crust. The mule followed, with that patient gait that outlasts most things. The trees heard them leave. The clearing grew quiet again the way a room does when a door shuts and the sound has to find a place to sit. They rode down the faint road he had worn over years without meaning to keep count. Snow thinned where the hill fell toward the creek. The water showed in places black and quick under ice. A raven sat in a spruce and watched them pass and said nothing. The sun was out, but low, a cold coin no one could spend for warmth. Nora looked straight ahead and kept the mule's nose behind Copper's hip. She listened to Wyatt's breath when the trail climbed. She listened to the small sounds of leather and iron and hoof and knew them better with every yard. Her ribs ached with the sway. The ache was honest. She liked it more than fear. They crossed the little saddle where the wind liked to sit and moved into the trees again. The country opened and closed around them the way a hand does when it is thinking. The cold worked on their faces until the skin felt new. Wyatt did not talk. He rode with his shoulders a little forward to guard his side and save his strength. He watched the line of the trail and the white banks and the places where a drift could hide a stump. He listened the way he had always listened. The world did not feel empty. It felt full of things that could be named. They rode out of the valley by the path he had used to bring furs down in other winters. The hill fell away slow and steady. The trees thinned and the sky grew bigger. In the space between one breath and the next, the cabin was gone behind them. The bar sat in its irons, and the stove would keep its heat for a time and then go gray. The door would hold. They reached the old wagon road where the snow had been broken by other hooves. The cut in the pass stood ahead blue in shadow. The day kept its bright, thin light. Copper lifted his head and set a more serious pace. The mule followed with a patient nod. The wind was only wind. The road was only a road. The sound of their going took up its place in the cold air and stayed there. The road widened and smoothed where other hooves had gone. Ruts had thawed and frozen and turned to iron. The river showed black and quick under a lace of ice, then ducked under snow again. By midday, the hills let go, and the valley opened into hard, packed dirt and boardwalks nailed in front of false fronts. Kestrel Falls sat in the cold like a row of teeth. Wyatt slowed Copper to a walk. Nora brought the mule even with his stirrup for a moment, and looked down the street. Children ran along the boards, and then stopped to stare. A woman in a shawl turned away and tugged her daughter inside. The air smelled like coal smoke and whiskey and pork fat. Someone swung a door, and laughter spilled and cut off. A sign hung over the sheriff's office on two chains that squealed where they rubbed the iron brackets. The building sat between a bank with a polished door and an undertaker with a window that showed a single suit on a headless form. Wyatt drew Copper to the hitch rail. He set his jaw and slid down slow. The ground reached up toward him, faster than he liked. He caught the horn, found his feet, and stood with his weight a little forward to protect his side. Nora swung off the mule and looped the lead. She tucked the coat close to the small revolver heavy against her hip. Her hair sat smooth under the bandana. The carved feather rested inside the coat where she could feel its thin shape. Wyatt pushed the office door open. The room was warm from a stove set in a corner and stale with old pipe smoke. A large man in a shirt that pulled at the buttons sat behind a desk, with his boots up and his hat pushed back. He looked up without moving his feet. "Help you," he said. "This man is hurt," Nora said before her courage had a chance to fall quiet. "We need a doctor, and we need to report a crime." The sheriff took his feet down. He looked slow. He looked at Wyatt's face and then at the bandage that had bled through and stained the shirt. His gaze slid to Nora. He let it travel from her hair to the coat that did not fit to the boots that had seen miles and repair to the mud on the hem. A curl of satisfaction tugged the corner of his mouth. He reached to the corner of his desk and pulled a paper free from under a blotter. He stood and walked past Wyatt to the board outside. He came back with the paper and slapped it on the desk so the black letters showed big. The drawing was crude and knew too much. The name under it knew enough. "Wanted," the sheriff read, $100 for the murder of Silas Pike, signed Reverend Abel Cole. Nora felt the floor move. She did not look down. The lines of the drawing looked like her face if a hard hand had drawn it. She kept her eyes where they were. She said nothing. Wyatt's voice came out steady. "Her name is Nora Hale. She defended herself. I saw the marks. I saw 2 sets of tracks and 1 set dragged. I saw a place where a man beat a woman with a rifle. I saw where they left her in the snow." "You saw what she wanted you to see," the sheriff said. His voice had an easy scorn in it, like a man trying a joke he had told before. "I see a paper signed by a man of God." The room changed without anyone opening the door. A crowd had grown on the boardwalk and pushed in. A man with a stained apron from the saloon shouldered through and pointed a fat finger at Nora. "There," he said. "That is her. Reverend's girl that ran. Told you all. Came back with some mountain sinner. I say, string her up and be done." A handful of voices grunted agreement. Someone said witch and laughed. The sheriff lifted a hand to show he could measure the wind and go with it. Wyatt put a palm flat on the desk. "You will not try her in the street." The sheriff looked at him and saw a man pale with fever who did not lean. He looked at the faces behind him and saw mouths ready to open wide and swallow anything that tasted like a show. A woman's voice came from the crowd. "Sheriff Reeves," it said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The men near the door made room without thinking. She was in black from collar to cuff, not because it was stylish, but because it kept questions away. Her hair was pulled smooth and tight. The lines at her mouth said she had put work before grief and then gone back to grief when the work was done. She stepped inside and the temperature of the room changed for reasons that had nothing to do with the stove. "Mrs. Whitaker," the sheriff said, already softer, "there is a warrant. This is official." "This is Nora Hale," Mrs. May Whitaker said. She did not glance at the paper. She looked at Nora as if she had known her face first and only later learned her name. "She stayed with me last fall when Reverend Cole came through. She taught my grandsons their letters at my table. She sang them a song about boats because we have no boats and they should know the word." She turned to the sheriff without moving her feet. "You will not put her in a cell." The saloon man huffed. "Reverend says she killed a man." Mrs. Whitaker let her eyes rest on him. "Reverend says many things." A farmer with dust ground into his cuffs spoke up from the doorway. "Sheriff A. hearin'. Let us hear it in the hall with a gavel and a chair. You like a crowd when you stand up front. You can have one then." The sheriff looked from the faces at the door to the paper on his desk. He looked at Wyatt, who had not wavered. He looked at Mrs. Whitaker, who could set her jaw without tightening her throat. "A public hearing," he said at last. "Tomorrow morning, Town Hall, 10 o'clock. He put a hand on the paper and turned it face down as if it might stop being a snake if it could not see. "She stays put until then." Deputy at the door. "In my house," Mrs. Whitaker said. "I post her bond on my name." "You got no money on a piece of paper," the sheriff said. "I have a name that sits heavier in this town than your salary," Mrs. Whitaker said. She did not raise her voice to do it. "And I brought the doctor with me because I am not a fool." A narrow man with a leather bag slid in behind her and coughed to announce himself. He pushed his wire spectacles up his nose and lifted a hand that said move. Wyatt sat because sitting was going to happen anyway. The doctor cut the bandage and made the small sounds doctors make when they agree with facts. He cleaned the wound proper and packed it and wrapped it tight with a strip that had been boiled. Wyatt kept his eyes on the far wall and counted to keep still. "Keep him warm and still," the doctor said. "There is no fever worth the word now. He has luck and not much else. He will need quiet." He put his bag shut and looked at the sheriff the way a man looks at a child who has not earned sweets. Mrs. Whitaker held the door and let the crowd step back. She turned to Nora. Up close, she smelled like lye soap and clean wool. The skin at her throat was thin as paper. "You come with me," she said. "You too, Mr. T. Sloan." Wyatt stood with help and walked because he had decided to. The deputy fell in behind at a respectful distance and did not make his hand heavy on the gun. The saloon man grumbled and went back to his door where his own heat and noise lived. The sheriff watched them cross the street and weighed which way the town would lean if a wind came. Mrs. Whitaker's house sat one street over with a small porch and a maple that had kept a few leaves. A tin star hung in a window from a string and turned slowly. She led them into a parlor that had a braided rug and a mantel with a row of shells that some boy had brought home years ago from a river 12 miles away and called Ocean. The room held the smell of bread and cedar. "Sit," she said. She moved through the house with the soft speed of a woman who had done the same work long enough to do it with half her mind. She brought quilts and laid them over Wyatt's legs. She poured water and set it by Nora's hand. She noticed the bandana and gave the smallest nod as if the color had something to say, and she had heard it. She left them and came back with a small wooden box. Inside lay a ribbon wide, and the color of dried cherries, not quite red and not brown. She closed the box before the thing could become a question. "You will sleep in the spare room," she said to Nora. "He will take the sofa. The stove holds heat better than a fire. The deputy will sit on the porch with a blanket and a bad attitude. You will not open the door without my voice." "Thank you," Nora said. The words felt like bread more than a courtesy. Mrs. Whitaker shrugged like it was nothing and not nothing. "You taught my boys to read before their hands were ready to write. I have this much in me." She set the box on the mantel where the light could find it if it wished. She looked at Wyatt. "You are a stubborn man. Do not die in my parlor." He gave her a look that had humor in it, small and stubborn like the man himself. "I will do what I can." The deputy cleared his throat on the porch and shifted his chair. He tried to sound bored for a while, and then gave up and listened to the house the way a house likes to be listened to. The street outside fell quiet and then loud and then quiet as the saloons filled and men told each other who they were. Nora stood in the small room that would be hers and touched the edge of the quilt. The fabric had worn places where a hen man had found it 100 nights. She took her coat off and laid it over the chair. The feather slid in the pocket and came to rest. She pulled it out and held it to the window. Light showed the grain. Blood had dried dark and fine along the quill. She set the feather on the washstand and laid her palm over it for a second. In the parlor, Wyatt had closed his eyes and found a breath he could keep. He had one hand on the edge of the sofa and the other set on his stomach as if he could hold the bandage there by will. He could smell bread in the kitchen and the starch of clean curtains. Mrs. Whitaker moved through the rooms like a tide. She put a kettle on and set 2 cups on the table. She opened a cupboard and took out a jar of plum preserves and a small square of cheese. She cut it into careful slices as if the knife could make the world right in small ways. She did not fuss. She did not ask questions. She let her house hold the people in it. The deputy knocked once to let her know he still existed. She opened the door and handed him a cup. He nodded and put his feet up on the railing in a way that tried to look lazy and came off grateful. The air had the bite of coming cold. Lanterns along the street made small islands of yellow. Nora washed her face in a bowl that had a chip along the rim. The water ran cool over her skin and took the grit away. She looked at her reflection in the little glass that wavered and showed a girl who had lost and gained and could not say which part was larger. She dried her face and tucked a piece of hair back into the bandana. She stepped back into the parlor. Wyatt opened his eyes. They held on to each other without touching. Mrs. Whitaker poured tea and put the cups in their hands. The sound of voices from the street came through the walls, less than words and more than noise. They drank. The house settled. The day went to the edges and waited. The room felt like a place where things could be said and be heard. The ribbon in the small wooden box caught no light and did not need to. Morning came thin and yellow along the edges of town. Frost held to the steps and the porch rails. Mrs. Whitaker set a cup in Nora's hands and looked once at the bandana. She opened the small wooden box on the mantel and drew out the ribbon wide and the color of dried cherries. "Hold your head up," she said. She tied the ribbon at the base of Nora's braid and smoothed it with her palm. The touch was brief and sure. The town hall sat where the street bent, a square room used for Sunday and dances and arguments that needed a chair to listen. The stove in the corner worked hard and still could not clear the cold. Benches were full. Men stood along the walls. Women claimed a row and kept their children close. Boots knocked mud off against the step and then tracked the last of it inside. Sheriff Reeves set a battered gavel on the table and tapped it once. The sound did not carry as far as he wanted. He tapped again. It did better the second time. Reverend Abel Cole stood to one side with a man who wore a suit that fit better than his conscience might. Hank Mercer sat near them, with his jaw wrapped and his eyes small and watchful. He moved like a man afraid the chair would bite. Mrs. Whitaker led Nora and Wyatt to the front bench and sat between them and the aisle, as if her body could decide who could pass. Wyatt was pale and clean. The doctor's new bandage held white against his shirt. He kept one hand on the bench to steady himself and the other on his knee. Nora felt the ribbon at her neck and the small tug where it tied. Sheriff Reeves cleared his throat and worked at the sound of authority. "This hearing will listen to the matter of one Nora Hale accused by warrant of the murder of Silas Pike. We are here to hear words and not to throw them at each other. Reverend Cole, you asked to speak first. Speak." Reverend Cole stepped forward. He had a handsome face and eyes that seemed to look past men to some light behind them. He folded his hands and bowed his head for a breath that felt practiced. When he lifted his face, his voice filled the room. "Friends," he said, and let the words sit on the crowd warm and familiar. "We stand in grief. We have lost a good man. Silas Pike was simple and faithful. He sang when we sang and worked when we worked. He was tempted as we are all tempted. He met a troubled soul on the road, a young woman full of pride and restless hunger. We took her in, we showed her kindness, we tried to guide her. She repaid it with blood." He paused and looked at Nora as if he could see through her instead of at her. His sorrow had a shine to it that caught weak hearts. A murmur ran along the benches. "We found Silas in the woods," Cole continued, letting his voice soften and darken where it needed to. Knife in his side. He had his Bible in his hand. She had fled like Cain. We hunted for her and could not find her. God gave me a vision in prayer that a sinner had hidden her a man outside the law. I asked for your help as my duty asks, and here she is. He bowed his head again, the picture of grief one might hang on a wall. The lawyer at his elbow nodded, as if he had paid money for the moment and found it worth the price. Sheriff Reeves turned to Hank Mercer. "You were there," he said. "Tell us what you saw." Hank swallowed. His jaw was tight under the bandage, and he winced when he moved it. He looked at Reverend Cole and then at the lawyer. He took a breath that smelled like fear. She said at him, Hank said, pointing at Nora with a finger that shook. She was always looking at us, always making the talk go a certain way. She asked Silas to walk and pray. I followed because I worried for him. I heard a scream. I ran. She was standing there with a knife. He reached for his book and she stuck him, said the devil wanted it. I tried to stop her. She came at me. I had to hit her. Thought she was dead. I would have carried her in if I thought she breathed. The lie stood in the room like a piece of bad furniture. People moved their eyes around it and pretended to find it useful. A woman near the front pressed her lips together, as if that could keep from swallowing it. Sheriff Reeves turned to Wyatt. Mr. Sloan, you brought her to town. You say you have something to say. Wyatt stood slow. The room watched him as one watches a man who could fall and still be dangerous. He set a hand on the table as if it were a post on a narrow bridge. He spoke in the voice of a man used to giving information when asked not to persuading. I found her in the snow, he said. He let the simple facts do their work. At Cutthroat Ridge, there were 3 sets of tracks where the trees open. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman's tracks dragged and scuffed, like her knees had done some of the walking. The men's prints were whole and deep and clean. There was a place where the snow showed the mark of a rifle stock. There was blood spatter that pointed away from a body which is not how the dying walk. There were signs of a struggle in a circle the size of that stove. I tracked a little farther and found where the men went back toward the road and the woman crawled for the pines. I did not draw that in my head. It was on the ground. I read it. He paused, and the room shifted toward him without meaning to. Men who had never tracked in their lives leaned forward because a thing told plain sits different in the ear. I saw her body, Bo, he said. What hands had done. Bite on her shoulder, thumb marks on her throat, bruises in the shape of fingers. She did not do that alone. I carried her to my place. I cleaned the wounds. I brought her here when I heard talk on the pass that the men who did it were coming to finish the job. That is all. He sat. He did not look at Nora. He did not need the room to think he was making his words larger by looking at a woman. He fixed his eyes on the blank part of the far wall, where light made a pale square. The lawyer smiled the way a man smiles when he finds the trick card at the bottom of the deck. A story from a man who says he can read the ground, he said. Gentlemen, ladies, you know how snow moves. You know how a man can see what he wants to see. A buzz rose, part hunger for noise, part uncertainty. Sheriff Reeves lifted the gavel and set it down twice. The sound hit hard and did its job. He looked at Nora then for the first time without a smirk. Miss Hale, he said, tell the room what happened. Nora stood because to speak sitting would make the words crawl. The ribbon at her neck felt like a hand that steadied. She faced the benches and saw faces she would not remember because she could not carry them all. I traveled with Reverend Cole, she said. Her voice had edges that came from being sharpened by cold. He said my pride needed to be put right. He said humbling. 2 of his men came to me by the wagon, Silas Pike, Hank Mercer. They put hands on me. They told me to be still for God. I had a small knife for fruit. I put it in Silas so he would let me go. He let me go. Hank hit me until I stopped moving. They took my money and my brooch. They left me. I woke and crawled. She said the words like stones laid in a straight line. She did not dress them. She did not raise them. When she finished the line, she did not speak more. The room did not move at first. Then a woman put a hand to her throat and let it fall. A man near the back cursed softly and looked at his boots. The lawyer opened his mouth and shut it when a voice came from the standing crowd by the door. I have something to say. Heads turned. A man in a hat crushed flat by use stepped forward. His coat had dust ground into it where work brings its hands. His face was the kind that weather respects. He touched the brim of the hat at Mrs. Whitaker and at no one else. Jed Carver, Sheriff Reeves said, surprise loosening his voice. You got business here. I know the Reverend, Jed Carver said. His words had the weight of a fence post knocked into the ground with a maul. He came through my place last spring. Had a girl with him. German, honey hair, not much English, wore a blue dress. They stayed 2 nights and moved on. 3 days after they left, I went up into the high country to check a break in the line. Found wolves had been busy in a draw. There was cloth in the brush, blue, same as the girl's dress. I knew it because my wife had mended the hem, and we laughed about it being crooked. The Reverend told me she ran off. He said some other story about a better life. He lies easy. A sound moved through the room that was not approval and not shock. It was the sound people make when a thing clicks in their head and can no longer be turned to something else. Reverend Cole's face did not hold the soft sorrow now. His jaw tightened for the first time. His eyes flicked toward the door as if measuring distance. Hank Mercer stood too fast for his chair, and the chair went over. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at Nora, and his eyes had the hot, flat light of a man who has found one target in a world that has turned against him. "You," he said. He had to force the word past the bandage. "You brought this on me." He lunged. It was not clever. It was fast. He crossed the space between the table and the bench and reached for her throat with hands that had learned that shape. Wyatt moved. He was not quick on his feet, not with the wound. He was still between Hank and Nora at the right time. He did not reach for the gun. He put his weight on his left foot and threw one straight punch with his right hand. It was not wide. It was not pretty. It landed at the hinge of Hank's jaw with a sound like green wood cracking. Hank's head snapped. His knees forgot their work. He fell and stayed there. The bandage slipped crooked across his face. Silence broke into noise. Men stood and then sat when the sheriff found his gavel and found his voice. "Enough," he said, and this time the room believed him. He turned to Reverend Cole. The shine was gone from the preacher's eyes. There was a look there that had been behind the shine all along. The sheriff saw it now because the room had made it possible for him to see. "Reverend Abel Cole," he said, and put the weight of the word reverend where it belonged, which was nowhere. "You will come with me for questions on the death of a young woman unknown, and on what happened to Nora Hale and to Silas Pike." Cole lifted his chin. "This is a circus," he said. "This is the devil at work." Mrs. Whitaker stood without fuss. "So is a tent with a false prophet in it," she said. She did not look away when he tried to search her face for doubt, and found none. Two men from the back stepped forward without needing to be asked, and took Hank by the arms. He did not protest. He spit blood on the floor and looked at nothing. The sheriff took out his cuffs and put them on Reverend Cole's wrists. The sound of iron around bone rang in the air like a small, hard bell. People began to breathe again. The stove sighed. The smell of hot iron and wool and human worry shifted to something else. Not clean, not dirty, just possible. Sheriff Reeves looked at the room as if it were a horse that had pranced and now stood square. "This hearing is ended for now," he said. "There will be a trial as the law allows, for today Nora Hale is not to be held." He said the last toward Mrs. Whitaker. It sounded like an apology that could pass in public. Mrs. Whitaker inclined her head once. She touched Nora's elbow and turned her toward the aisle with the ease of a woman guiding a child through crowds after church. Wyatt took one step and a half step and found his feet without help he wanted to need. Outside, the cold felt clean. The street looked the same and did not feel the same. Men looked twice at Reverend Cole with iron on his wrists. Women stared at Hank's slack mouth and then looked away. The sky had lost some of its thin yellow and gone to white. Mrs. Whitaker's maple had a bird in it that did not sing because the air was wrong for it. The deputy stood from his chair on her porch and tried not to look as if he had hoped for a day that made sense. Mrs. Whitaker opened her door and let the heat from her stove meet the cold from the street in a brief, polite handshake. Nora stepped inside. She reached into her coat and touched the feather. Her fingers found the dried ridge along the quill. The ribbon sat warm at her neck. Wyatt crossed the threshold and set his palm against the wall for a moment. The house took their weight and did not complain. The door closed behind them with a latch that knew its work. The town did not go back to sleep. Word moved fast as smoke. By noon, the hall had a judge and a table dragged to the front. The law could walk on two legs when it had a crowd to carry it. Reverend Cole stood with iron on his wrists and a smooth face he could not keep smooth. Hank Mercer sat with a crooked bandage and a jaw that did not line up with itself. Jed Carver told again what he had seen in the high draw. The judge asked for names and measurements and the color of the dress. Jed gave what he could and kept the parts that were not his to give. Mrs. Whitaker spoke when she was asked. She said Nora had taught letters that fall, that she had left the house each day and returned each night, that she had never once asked for money. The doctor spoke in the plain way of doctors. He said a wound looked like a wound. He said bruises looked like hands. The room listened because the room had decided to. The judge did not waste words. He ordered Hank held for assault and for the attack on Wyatt in the pass. He ordered Reverend Cole to a cell to wait for trial on a charge heavier than any he had thought to lift. The sheriff took the preacher by the arm. The iron spoke against iron. The door at the back took them away. No one asked Nora to stand. No one told her to sit. The judge looked at her and then at the crowd. "No charge stands on her today," he said. He rapped the gavel once. It sounded like a lid set tight on a box. The hall emptied and filled the street. People walked slower when they passed Nora and faster when they had gone past her. A woman brought her a lemon sweet and set it in her hand without looking at her face. A man touched his hat and then turned away and spat into the street because he did not have words he trusted. Wyatt walked with care, the bandage held and the fever kept to itself. He stood on Mrs. Whitaker's porch and watched the town watch them. Jed Carver came from the livery with a nod for the deputy and a soft word for Mrs. Whitaker. "I bought a horse," Jed said to Wyatt, "or I held on to a thing until you could get it back. Copper is in the back stall. A man tried to bid me up, and I told him he did not want that fight." Wyatt reached for words and found only the small ones. "Thank you." Jed shifted his weight the way a man does when he has said what he came to say and would rather be back at his fence line. "There is a wagon needs mending at my place. I will bring it round. You can take it for the price of your thanks." Mrs. Whitaker stood with her hands on her hips and listened. "And I have blankets and jars and a skillet that remembers cornbread," she said. "I have a friend on the far side of the river who keeps a crate of glass and says I never use my favors. I plan to prove her wrong." Wyatt started to protest. She silenced him with a look that would have quieted a room full of boys. He closed his mouth. Afternoon dragged its shadows along the street. The saloons emptied and filled in waves. Children ran in packs and dared each other to tap the jailhouse door. The deputy sat straighter when the curtains moved next to him. The house held a constant small warmth. Nora tried to walk through the town and be only feet and skirt and woman. Whispers stuck to her like burrs. Shop windows showed her face back to her with their wavering glass. She saw curiosity where accusation had been. It did not sit kinder. She stopped at the bridge and looked down at the river pushing black and steady under the ice. Her breath showed small and went away. The ribbon at the base of her braid felt like a hand that knew where to rest. The feather lay inside the coat where it had learned to sit. Wyatt found her there. He stood beside her without touching the rail. He looked at the water and the line where it met ice. He watched it move without hurry under the white. "They do not see me," she said. "They see what they can repeat," he said. A cart rattled across, and the driver did not look at either of them. A dog crossed behind and sniffed and chose not to stay. "They say my name," she said. "They do not use it for me. We make a place where no one has to," he said. She looked at him. The winter had carved more lines beside his mouth and at the corners of his eyes. The bandage under his coat had bled through at the edge and dried in a rough brown. He had shaved that morning too close on one side. His hair needed cutting. He stood like a man who had made up his mind and did not plan to move it. They turned back toward Mrs. Whitaker's porch. Inside the parlor smelled like bread and cedar and a little of the liniment the doctor had left. Wyatt sat where the quilt did not itch against his skin. Nora took the chair and turned it slightly so her knees faced him. The house held them, and the sound of the street without letting either break. Mrs. Whitaker moved in the kitchen and let pans talk. "Where?" Nora asked, her voice low so it did not have to travel far. "Snake River Plain," Wyatt said. "West." He did not say more. He had learned to be careful with plans. He looked down at his hands. He turned one palm up and then set it back down. Nora nodded. She had never seen a canyon. She had seen the picture in a book of a river that ate rock one grain at a time and did not tire. She had seen a map and put her finger on all the places that had names and on the places that did not. She pressed the ribbon flat against the back of her neck. Mrs. Whitaker came in with a plate and set it on the table. "You will take the bread and the cheese," she said. "I will not argue it. The boys will ask if they can sleep in the parlor, and I will tell them no. The deputy is on my porch pretending he is not cold. I will send him a second blanket if he admits he needs it." Nora smiled for the first time that day, and meant it. "He will not admit it." "No," Mrs. Whitaker said. "He will not." She took a folded slip from her apron and pushed it along the table with 2 fingers. "Jed paid the back tax on a wagon the Smiths could not keep. He signed it toward you. The paper is yours. The wood is his to mend, and then yours to break again as you see fit." Wyatt took the slip. The ink climbed up in loops that meant little and enough. He put the paper away and put his hand over that pocket. "You have people here now," Mrs. Whitaker said to Nora, her voice neither soft nor sharp. That does not mean you have to stay to be looked at. Night grew early around the house. The street lamps were oil and bright where they dared. The jail had one light. It threw a square of yellow that cut the dark and came apart in the cold. Somewhere a piano tried a hymn and slid off into a tune that knew less about church. Wyatt slept for an hour and woke with breath caught in his chest. Nora sat in the chair by the window and watched his face settle again. She watched the glass dew over and clear and dew again. She thought about the pass and the way sound traveled there. She thought about the ridge and how the bar had sounded when it fell into the irons. The memory came with the clean ache of muscles used and not broken. Jed brought the wagon at dawn the next morning. The wheels had a new peg in one spoke and a new strap on the box. He set the brake and stuck his hands in his coat. "She will ride," he said. "She does not like to hurry. She remembers another family. Sits better when the box is full of something heavier than quilts." Wyatt walked around it and saw the work. The wagon smelled like old wood and wheels that had known ruts. He ran a hand over the rim where someone had carved initials so shallow the weather had not stolen them yet. He nodded once. Mrs. Whitaker came to the door with a sack and a wooden crate. The crate clinked when she set it down. "Jars," she said. "Glass is a small miracle. Use it and try not to break it." Nora tied the ribbon tight and tucked the ends under. She lifted the sacks and the crate and set them in the wagon. The weight felt good on her arms. She checked Copper's girth and the mules as Mrs. Whitaker watched, with a face that tried not to show pride and failed a little. The deputy called down from the porch. "You need a permit for that thing," he said, and then grinned so the room inside him would not get in the way of the grin. "I am joking. We never do that here, Mrs." Whitaker rolled her eyes and handed him a third blanket. He took it and did not thank her in words because he would have to admit he needed it. He touched the brim of his hat. The day moved in small chores. Nora wrapped bread in cloth. She stacked blankets and tied them with rope so the knots would come free in the cold. Wyatt counted cartridges and folded a length of twine and set it on the seat. He could feel the wound tug when he reached too far, and he remembered not to reach. The stove in the parlor put a steady heat in the floorboards. The house drew it in and kept it. Afternoon shifted to a later shade. The trial proper would come with more men and more papers and more days where the town would sit on benches and pretend not to enjoy it. For now, the loud part was done. The quiet worked on them both. It was not the old quiet that had chased Wyatt into storms. It was not the blank quiet that had met Nora in the snow. It was something with corners and warmth that did not belong to the town and did not need the town to name it. Mrs. Whitaker set 2 tin cups on the porch rail and watched steam rise. She stood with her hands in her apron and looked down the street toward the river and then away. "When you are ready," she said, "I will walk you to the edge of town. My boys will show you the cut where the road lifts. It is not much of a road, but it knows where it is going." Nora nodded. The ribbon sat warm at her neck. The feather in her pocket made a light weight that she had gotten used to. Wyatt stood beside her and watched the line of the hills. The wagon waited in the yard with the brake set and the box loaded to the rails. The street carried voices and boot heels and the distant hammering of a man making something he planned to sell. Evening reached up along the porch posts. The house held them. The deputy took the chair down from 2 legs to 4 and settled. A bird hopped on the fence and found nothing to eat and flew off without fuss. Inside the room kept a space for what came next by simply being itself. The stove ticked. The quilts held their warmth. The door latch sat ready to lift when a hand asked it. The quiet in the house had weight enough to carry. They left at first light. Mrs. Whitaker walked with them to the edge of town, her skirt catching the frost along the grass. The deputy tipped his hat and tried not to look like he cared. Jed Carver tightened the wagon's brake and thumped the wheel with his fist as if to bless it. Copper tossed his head. The mule breathed out a slow cloud and blinked. Mrs. Whitaker climbed the step and put both hands on Nora's. The ribbon at the base of Nora's braid matched the brown red of the maple leaves that had not fallen. Mrs. Whitaker squeezed once and stepped down. She did not say the sort of thing people say at gates. The road took them past the last yards and into the scrub where the land let go of fences. The ruts were old. They held the wagon wheels where men before had cut their line. The sky opened. Cold air shrugged off town smells and took on the clean bite of sage and melt. Wyatt sat the box seat with his coat buttoned and the bandage snug against his ribs. The weight of the rifle settled behind his boots. Nora took the reins. The leather felt honest in her hands. Copper set a steady walk. The mule nodded and kept time without hurry. Days slid under the wheels. They crossed the river at a shallow with stones that clicked under hooves. They slept in the wagon with quilts over them, and the stars pushing hard on the top of the canvas. They ate bread and cheese, and the last of the preserves with a pocket knife. Coffee boiled down black and useful at dawn. At night, a small fire took its place against the wind and did not give up. They passed a stand of aspen that had kept their gold. The leaves shook like coins. They rode a ridge where the world fell away on both sides and rose again in long waves. They crossed a strip of prairie that lifted and dropped under a thin sky. Coyotes called far off, polite and hungry. A hawk rode its slow circle above a draw and then slid away. On the fourth evening, the land changed in a breath. The wagon rolled out of low grass onto a flat of gray soil where the wind had pressed the earth smooth. The horizon broke. A canyon opened its mouth and showed its dark red throat. It ran east and west and took the sun into it until the light seemed to come from inside stone. Wyatt stood on the breakboard and looked out. He did not speak. Copper blew and stamped as if to object to the edge. The mule lifted both ears and then one, and decided to trust the break. They walked to the rim and stood with boot toes, a careful hand back. The drop was clean and sudden. Cottonwoods gathered below along a thread of water that flashed in the last of the day. A spring ran out of the rock on their side and built a shallow run that slid into the grass and then fed toward the lip. The air smelled like mineral and dry sun, and a little damp where the spring made a trick of spring in a hard place. "This," Wyatt said. Nora nodded. Wind lifted the tail of the ribbon and set it down again. She could hear water make a small talk where it touched stone. The sound found a place behind her ribs and stayed there. They turned the wagon back from the rim to a patch of ground that sat higher than the wash. They unyoked Copper and the mule and led them to the spring. They stood with buckets and watched the light leave the top of the canyon and pool in the bottom where it went soft and warm before it gave out. Wyatt set the fire with dry brush and sage. It caught fast and burned with a sharp blue edge, then settled to orange and made a smell that clipped the nose and stayed in the coat. They ate near it. They did not talk much. The sound of the place did the talking. In the morning, they marked corners with piles of stone that fit the hand. They walked the lines and felt where the wind came and where water would go. Wyatt put the first stake where the door would face. He sighted along his thumb and marked the place with the weight of a man who sees walls that are not yet there and knows how to make them stand. Nora measured with a length of twine and a stick. She tied knots along it where the plan told her. They built the foundation with the red rock that lay split in the wash. Wyatt lifted and set. Nora handed and steadied and learned the name of each shape by the way it sat against the next. Mud from the spring and chopped straw made a mortar that dried the color of rust. It stained their hands and left lines in their palms as if drawing a map of the work. They cut logs in a stand of pine that had crossed the creek in a flood years back and grown thick on the far side. Wyatt showed her the saw and took the end that pulled, while she took the end that steadied. The blade whispered and then sang. Their breath found the same pace because the saw demanded it. When her arms shook, he set his big hands over hers and said easy, "Let the teeth do it." She learned to listen to wood and to the small changes in his breath. Walls rose a log at a time, corners notched clean. The door frame stood square because they checked it and then checked it again. They set a window they had bought at the post with money and a favor. The glass wavered and kept its bubbles. It caught the sky and gave it back bent and brighter. They laid a roof of poles and brushes and a layer of sod that they cut from the flats. The grass on top kept living. In first light, it was green. At noon, it curled and went pale, then came back after the sun slid west. The roof smelled like summer, even as the air went knife bright. By the time the first hard white fell, the stove had been hauled and set. The pipe ran true and drew clean. The room filled with a heat that did not ask permission. The floor was good dirt stamped tight and swept with a willow broom. The bed was a built frame and a tick stuffed with straw. The door swung on hinges scavenged from a barn and oiled with bacon fat. The latch lifted and dropped and learned their hands by weight. They lived in that room. They worked out of it. Wyatt broke the ground where the soil held a seam of dark. He set corn and beans and did the hard bargain with wind and sun. He hunted the breaks at dawn and came back with a hare more often than a deer, and they salted what they could. Nora scrubbed the floor with hot water and lye and hung shirts on a line and learned the smell of clean that had no store name. Word traveled. A family from the South Ridge came to look at the canyon and left a sack of jerky on the step without asking. A pair of children came the next week and stayed sitting on the log by the door with their feet not touching the ground. Nora brought out the Bible Mrs. Whitaker had given her because it was the book that had words in it, and she read out loud. The words did their old work and their new one at once. They came again. They brought cousins and a friend whose mother had pieced a dress out of 3 others. Nora set a crate on its side in the shade of the cottonwoods and called it a desk. She split a bit of charcoal and wrote letters on a flat stone. She set pebbles in rows and taught the small count to 10 and then to more. The ribbon in her hair made a line for measuring. A boy held the ribbon and did not break it. He learned the length of a word with it and grinned as if someone had handed him a coin. Wyatt worked on a fence and watched the lessons from where he knelt. He whittled a feather when his hands needed to busy. He smoothed its barbs with a bit of sand and cut a single small word along the quill on the side no one would see unless they looked close. The word fit the shape. He did not show it to her that day. He set it on the shelf he had built and let the fire find it and make the grain shine. They stood on the porch at night when the stars pushed down and the canyon kept its silence. Coyotes spoke from the far side. The spring talked to itself near the cottonwoods. Nora leaned her shoulder into his and felt him lean back without saying it. The wounded heat in him had cooled and pulled into a scar that pulled when he reached too far. He learned to reach a different way. One night, wind ran along the rim and rattled the grass on the roof. Wyatt stepped outside with no hat and tilted his head. He listened. The wind climbed the wall of the canyon and slid over the lip and went on. It was only wind. It did not carry anything but itself. He smiled once and went back in and shut the door without lifting the bar. They were married a month later when the circuit judge came through with a bad horse and a good pen. He stood in the doorway and wrote their names with care while they stood on the threshold. Wyatt said, "I do," with the same voice he used to say, "Hand me the saw." Nora said, "I do," and felt the words sit right in her chest. The judge ate a slice of bread with plum and took his fee in coffee and left with a wave that had dust in it. Winter came and went in its long way. Spring ran out of the ground early at their place. The cottonwoods leafed and made a soft shade that a child could sit in and read the same word without the light slipping off the page. The fence held. The corn did its small best. The stove breathed low and steady, and the room kept the kind of warmth that stays in the walls. They sat by the hearth one night with the door cracked to let the cool in. The latch lay back and did not take its work. The feather on the shelf caught the glow from the coals and showed the word Wyatt had cut along the quill. Nora lifted it and felt the smooth under her thumb. She turned it and the little cut letters showed. "Breathe." She put the feather back and set her hand on his. The ribbon lay coiled on the shelf beside it, because some nights her hair needed the night. The house listened. The canyon held its dark. The wind went by with the dry grass and did not stop. The latch waited. The fire settled to a red that would last until morning. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.